security groups. In this nugget, we'll be discussing security groups, and this is going to be critical to making sure that users can gain access to the resources that they're supposed to have, while at the same time not driving the administrator nuts because he or she is assigning permissions to individual users at a time. Instead, what we want to do is to place our users inside of groups and use them that way, and then assign permissions to just that single group. Then we can also take a look at the types of groups that we've got. We've got local groups, domain local, global, universal, distribution, all different kinds here. And we want to see the purpose of each one of these kinds of groups, as well as what the group scope of each one of them is. And this is where you can nest one group inside of another. So we'll take a look at that, as well as where you can use the various groups. Can you use it in its own domain? Can you use it in another domain? Where can it go? We'll take a look also at group conversion, which is real easy. Let's say, for example, I've created a global group, and then I suddenly realized, oops, that's not supposed to be a global group. That's supposed to be a universal group. Well, I'll show you how to quickly make that kind of a conversion, and then we'll also take a look at the default groups that are already there. Now, I'm not going to describe each one of them to you in rote fashion because there's quite a few of them there, but we will take a look at how to find out more information about them. I've got a 6-year-old son, and he's a really smart little guy. He's got his mother's genes in him. And I was training him how to clean up his room about a year ago. And I was telling him, hey, pick up a toy on this side of the room and walk over to the other side of the room and drop it in the box. And he would do that. He'd pick up just one toy at a time and drop it over in a little toy box, clear over on the other side of the room. And I said, hey, you know, what you ought to do is just pick up a bunch of them. So I taught him how to pick up 3 or 4 different ones at a time, drag them all the way over to the toy box and dump them in there. That way he wouldn't have to make so many trips. And he figured out that that was obviously less work, and he does a great job of it. Next up, I'm going to train him how to clean out my garage. Anyway, it's a similar function to what we have in Windows Server 2003, because you can manage multiple objects at once, or you can manage a single item and have it be just as effective. Well, we can do that in Active Directory as well with user accounts, for example. Now, if I need to allow users to access a resource here in the most fundamental possible way, then I would have to take individual user accounts one at a time and assign them permissions to a specific resource that they want to gain access to. Even if they all want the same kind of access or require the same kind of access, I would still have to assign permissions one at a time to each one of these users. And in the enterprise, very seldom is it ever just 3 people. Usually it's dozens or even hundreds of users for very commonly kinds of access resources that they want to access. This is our toy box over here that they want to gain access to. Guess I can make a little Jack in the Box here or something like that. Looks like something from Bride of Chucky. I don't know. Anyway, so we got a resource here that they want to access. And how we would typically do that is we would select a user account, one or more user accounts, and then we would apply them to a specific resource, like this temp folder. Maybe I want to share that out. So I'll go to the Sharing tab from the Properties, and I'll just click on Permissions here. And to be fundamental about it, I can just click on Change. Now, you notice that there's not that much you can do with this, Full Control, Change, or Read. Change meaning that they can add files to the folder. They can go ahead and modify the folder contents for any documents that they create and all that kind of stuff. So that's a pretty common permission to give on shared permissions, but that gets more granular here when we get to the security permissions, because the sharing permissions are just like the front door to a bank vault. So they go open that big bank vault. That's what gets them inside of the bank vault. And inside of that bank vault are all the safety deposit boxes, and that's what the security tab protects. That allows us to have individual users with specific permissions to this resource. So the Sharing tab is more general, the Security tab is more specific, and here I would want to add in my individual users that I want to gain access to this resource. Helga Hinkle needs Modify Resources, or Modify Access. I'd click Add again. Well, Todd Logan also needs the same kind of access. Or actually, it's Logan Todd, isn't it? That's right, I deleted Todd Logan. But anyway, there's Logan Todd. He also needs Modify Access. And I'd have to do this dozens or hundreds of times until we finally got all the individual users that we wanted to gain permission to a specific folder. Well, you can see where I'm headed with this. It makes much more sense to just lump all of these users together into a security group that gives them some kind of a common access. So if I add all these users into a security group, then I can take this group and one time assign permissions to this folder. And moreover, I might also have another resource. Maybe I've got some kind of a printer down here. There's paper coming out of it, something like that. Anyway, I think my 6-year-old's a better artist than I am. But anyway, there's a printer. Well, now I don't have to assign again redundantly individual permissions for these users for that printer. I just take the same group I created a little bit earlier, and I just add resource permissions to that printer as well. Now let's talk about the different types of groups that you can have. And the first one is a distribution group. This is really used for email programs such as Exchange, so that you can collect a number of users into a single group and then send an email to that whole group at once. And we can also set up security groups, and that's going to really be our discussion here. The least used security group in a Windows Server 2003 environment is going to be a local group. And this kind of group cannot be created on a domain controller because the local group is stored in a local SAM database, or a Security Accounts Manager type database. That's only going to appear then on member servers or standalone computers, but never on domain controllers. And we don't have much use for local groups because that's the only place that are good, is just local, on the same computer that you create them. I cannot create a local group on a Windows XP computer, for example, and then somehow use it on a member server somewhere else. So that's what we'll be discussing the least. And then there's a domain local group. Now sometimes because of NT4 parlance, these will still be called local groups. You just have to look at the context. If it's talking about domain controllers or domain groups and they say that it's a local group, this is what the person really means, whoever's saying that. They mean domain local group. This is kind of a fallback, like I said, to NT4, because in NT4 you would create local groups, but they would be local to that domain controller and in its copy of the SAM. Well, guess what? That copy of the SAM got copied to BDCs on other domain controllers. Therefore, that local group wasn't so local. It would be copied in a number of different locations. So that's just kind of why they do that. But we call them domain local groups here. There's also global groups, which give us a little bit more scope in terms of their membership, and even more accurately in your application of them. You can use them just about anywhere. And then also universal, which are the most flexible type of group that you can use. Now let's go ahead and create a group or two here. Actually, we'll create one of each kind, domain, local, global, and universal groups. And here I've gone to the Phoenix OU, where I've just added in a few generic accounts here as well for Phoenix user 01 and so forth. Now I'm going to create a new group, and you'll notice that in this, I'm going to be able to create a domain, local, global, or a universal security or distribution group. And I'm just going to name this Phoenix Global so that we can also just tell by looking at it what kind of a group it is. And I'll just leave it as a global security group. And then we'll just click OK here. And that's pretty much it. That's all you have to do to create a group. And I'll create the other two offline real quick here. Now, in order to actually work with them, they have to have membership in order to be any good, because right now they're just groups that are just kind of sitting there doing nothing. So what I need to do is to add membership, and typically you'll add users to the global groups. So I'll go to the Members tab here, click on Add, and I can just enter in, Phoenix. Actually, how do I do that? Phoenix user 01. Let's try that one. We can add that one, and we can add a number of other groups in here as well if we like. And that's pretty much all you do. So adding members to a group is really pretty easy. By the way, you can also see what groups this group might be a member of. I don't have anything right now, but this would relate to group nesting, which we'll address also in this nugget. Simply where you put one group inside of another. Now, before we get into all of those membership issues, what we really ought to discuss next is more information about how you use the groups. What's the best way to use them? Should I put my users in universal groups? Should I put my users in global groups? Where should I put them? What groups should I nest inside of one another? What capabilities do I have for all of this stuff? And for that, let's go ahead and take a look at an item here. I'll put this document up on nuggetlab.com so you can download it from www.nuggetlab.com. So let's review what we can do with all of these things, and part of this has to do with the domain functional level. Now, for our context, and for most of what Microsoft discusses, your domain functional level will be either Windows 2000 native or Windows Server 2003 domain functional level, or DFL. However, I will also just briefly discuss what you have in terms of capabilities if you're in Windows 2000 mixed DFL. First of all, if you're in Windows 2000 mixed DFL, what can these respective groups contain? Well, a domain local group can contain accounts, and by that I mean just any user or computer account. And I can also nest global groups inside of a domain local group, and that was the very common practice ever since NT4. And then again, in Windows 2000 Mixed DFL, in global groups, I can have only accounts in there, user or computer accounts. I cannot nest one group inside of another in a global group. And then there's no such thing as a universal group in Mixed DFL, and that's because NT4 has no way of recognizing a universal group. Now, you can create, by the way, a universal group that is a distribution group. That is possible in Windows 2000 Mixed DFL, but as a security group, which is 99% of our discussion here, that cannot be done. Now let's also discuss Windows 2000 Native or Windows Server 2003 DFL, and for this, in the domain local groups, we can have pretty much the same thing we had in Mixed DFL. Any accounts from any domain, and any global group from any domain. However, on top of that, we can also add two new things. That is, a domain local group from the same domain and a universal group. And basically what this means is I can nest just about anything inside of a domain local group. Anything. The only thing I can't nest inside of a domain local group is another domain local group from a different domain. So to remember that, that's all we really have to remember to make it easier. You can't nest a domain local group from another domain inside of a domain local group. The only thing you can't do. And then for the global groups, I can nest accounts or global groups both from the same domain. And that's it. For universal security groups, I can add in, again, accounts from any domain, global groups from any domain, and universal groups from any domain. Notice that the one thing I cannot nest inside of this is any domain local group. Now, in addition, let's take a look at what they can access. And this, when I say access to over here, this means where I can put them in an ACLA. And that's where I showed you earlier, where you go to the security tab of a resource and you add users and or groups to the resource. Here we can access resources in the same domain by using domain local groups. We can access resources in any domain using a global group here. And then we can also access any resources in any domain using a universal group. Now, you can also do group conversions. This was not possible in NT, but we started to be able to do this in Windows 2000, and now we can still do it, of course, in Windows Server 2003. And for that, you can convert various group memberships. Let's go ahead and take a look. For domain local and global groups, I can convert both of those to universal groups. And I can convert a universal group to a domain local or to a global group. Let's go ahead and look at this as an example. If I wanted to take this domain local group and convert it to a universal group, I could do that. I just click on universal and apply, and there you go. Now I have a universal group. Of course, to make it intuitive, I'd probably want to rename this part of it too. But in any case, that's just an example of how that works. Now notice that when it's a domain local group, I can't use a global group. If I really need to do that, I can click on universal, apply, and then click global and apply, and now it is a global group. Likewise, if I want to go from global to domain local, I can't do that either unless I first go through the intermediary step of making it a universal group. Now, it occurred to me that I also ought to put a note in here, so I've parenthesized these bottom items in terms of group conversion, because you need to know that there's some exceptions to what you can and cannot convert. For example, you can convert a domain local to a universal group unless this domain local group already contains another domain local group. Then you would not be able to convert it to universal. Can you see why? Because a universal group cannot contain a domain local group. Therefore, you would be asking the conversion to do something that's impossible. And if you tried to do it, it would pop up an error message, a little dialog box that tells you exactly why. So at least that part makes it easy. The global group, you can convert it to a universal group, but you can't do it if it already contains a global group, and a universal group can be converted to a global group unless it already contains a universal group. Now then, let's take a look at a common scenario in how we might use those groups. Typically speaking, you're going to take the users and you're going to place them into global groups. This is because global security groups are going to be most often used to organize users that have similar network access requirements. So I'll take these sales users and add them to the sales global group. I also have a marketing security group down here, global group. I'll take a couple of marketing users, place them in that. And then I can use a domain local group, and the purpose of the domain local group is usually going to be to assign permissions to resources, printers, file shares, that kind of thing. Now remember, the domain local group is very flexible in terms of what its membership can be, and I've got these two global groups from the same domain, and then I've got another domain up here, cbtnuggets.com, and I've got another global group, the graphics global group, which has users in it. I didn't draw them in there, but we'll just assume that. And then this security group here is also put into the domain local group for the color printer. So now what we've done is we've assigned permissions to this color printer to only a single group. We've only had to assign permissions once instead of the number of times for all these users plus however many users are in this security group. Now notice that group nesting, where I've placed one group inside of another, also prevents me from having to assign the permissions 3 separate times to each individual global group. Since each one of these global groups has the same kind of access requirement to this printer, then all I have to do is to assign it one time to this domain local group and put all my users or all my groups into that domain local group. And the way we've kind of memorized this through a mnemonic in the past is we just take your users, put them into global groups, put your global groups into local groups, and then you're done. You're done. And what we usually do with that is just call it ugly. Users go into global groups go into local groups, and then you're done. We just put the Y on there so we can have a full word. for this acronym that we're using for our mnemonic. Okay, so let's go ahead and take a look at another scenario as well, and that would be nesting with universal groups. And this scenario starts out a lot like the last scenario we looked at. We take our users and add them into global groups, but now instead of having a domain local group, which is only useful for assigning to resources within its same domain, I want to take this universal group and apply it to a resource in a different domain up here in cbtnuggets.com where I've got these sales flyers. So again, I'll take my global groups, but this time I'm going to put them in this universal group, and now, rather than creating a separate domain local group up here and applying permissions to the sales flyers, now I just have to take this single group that I've already created as a universal group and just apply it to the ACL on these sales flyers. And again, that reduces my administration because I don't have to create another domain local group, and I don't have to manage the membership of it and all that kind of thing. Everything has already been done. Now I just reuse the same work I put into this group onto this resource. Now let's also take a look at our group memberships and our nesting and all of that in a graphical format as well to help cement it in our minds what we can do. Remember, we take our user accounts, we place them inside of our global groups. So let's start with the global groups. Global groups can accept membership from within their own domain. So I place my user inside of the global group, and then the global group can be nested inside of a domain local group in its same domain, or it can also be nested inside of a universal group here created also in its same domain. Likewise, if I had another global group out here in this same domain, I could take that global group and nest it inside of another global group in the same domain. Now, as far as cross-domain operations are concerned, I take the global group and I can place it inside of a domain local group in some other domain or inside of this universal group that's also been created in another domain. But I cannot take this global group and place it inside of another global group over here in a different domain. So let's think about what we can't do with a global group. Maybe that'll be just as easy to remember. You cannot take a global group and nest it inside of another global group in a different domain, and you cannot take an account from a different domain and make it a member of a global group in another domain. Now, although we usually assign permissions by using domain local groups, if you want to, you can take a domain local, or rather a global group here, and you can assign it permissions to, a folder or something like that over here as well if you want to. And it can be done on a folder within its own domain or some kind of resource there, or it can be done on a resource in some other domain as well. So if I had a folder over here that I wanted to grant access to, then I could use that same global group from one domain to access resources in another domain. Now, the rule of thumb for domain local memberships is that it can accept anything except for a domain local group from another domain. So what can I put inside of it? I can put inside of it a user account from the same domain, a user account from a different domain, a global group from the same domain, a global group from a different domain, a universal group from the same domain, a universal group from a different domain. So that's pretty much just about everything. Again, the only thing I can't do is take this domain local group from one domain and place it inside of this domain local group over here. In terms of our access, I can only access resources in the same domain using a domain local group. If I've got a resource over here, I cannot use this domain local group to access that resource. Now for my universal groups, it can accept accounts from its own domain or accounts from a different domain. By the way, when I say accounts, I have a picture of a user. You could also use computer accounts if you wanted to. And that's going to be useful if you have a computer account that needs to run a specific service without having a user logged on, for example. But we don't use that anywhere near as often, so that's why we're mostly talking about or showing user accounts here. Then I can take a global group from the same domain and place it inside of a universal group, or a global group from a different domain, place it inside of a universal group. What I cannot do is to take a domain local group and place it or nest it inside of a universal group from the same domain or from a different domain. Those two are not possible. Likewise, a universal group can be nested inside of another universal group in its same domain or in a different domain, from a different domain. So that's certainly a possibility. And then in terms of what a universal group can be a member of, a universal group can be a member of a domain local group in its same domain or a domain local group in a different domain. But remember that a universal group can never be a member of a global group. And then finally, a universal group can be used to access resources in its own domain or in a different domain. So it can be accessing resources here in its own domain or in a different domain. Now let's talk about a change in universal groups in Windows Server 2003 after having cleaned up a little bit here. First of all, in Windows 2000, let's take a look at it from that perspective. You have global catalogs in Windows 2000, and the global catalog, remember, contains every object from the entire forest. So the domain local group, global group, are in the global catalog from throughout the entire forest. However, there's also a universal group, and yes, it is also in the global catalog, but the domain local and global groups do not contain the contents of those groups in the global catalog. The universal group, however, does contain the contents, its contents, in the global catalog. So, if I've got 1,000 users in this universal group from this domain, well, those 1,000 users are going to be identified in the global catalog. Likewise, if I have 1,000 users from this domain in this universal security group, they're also in the global catalog. So I've got a total of 2,000 users between my two domains contained in this global catalog now, because that universal group lists its membership in this global catalog. Now, the reason why this became a big issue in Windows 2000 is because if I added or removed just one additional user, let's say this was a user that was not in there yet, I just add one user to this universal security group. Well, now in the global catalog, what happens is it updates the membership of all 2,000, and now it'd be 2001 since I added a user. It'd be 2001 members in that universal security group that it has to update and then would replicate to other global catalogs. Well, that causes a lot of unnecessary network traffic and replication traffic. Well, now in Windows Server 2003, rather than update the entire membership of that universal security group, it only takes that one additional user and it updates it to that one additional member. That way, when we replicate through Active Directory replication to our other global catalogs, it only says, hey, I've got this one new user here, and that's all it updates. We don't have that wasteful replication traffic now with all 2001 members. Now, this new feature is only available if you've upgraded the domain to Windows Server 2003 domain functional level. If you're still in the Windows 2000 native DFL, then the global catalog is going to have to update the entire membership of the universal group just like it did under Windows 2000. And that's why under Windows 2000, we always recommended that you don't put individual user accounts inside of universal groups. Although it's possible and you can do it, it's not a good practice under Windows 2000 or Windows 2000 native DFL. Instead, you should put groups inside of the universal group. In this case, of course, global groups or other universal groups inside of the universal group. Now, just because in Windows Server 2003 DFL, you will now have a better and more efficient way of updating the membership between global catalogs where it will only reflect the changes, it's still probably not a good idea to take individual user accounts and put them in universal groups because it's a lot more difficult to manage and there's a lot more individuals to have to manage in that group. Still better to take your users and to place them into your global groups and then your global groups down into your universal groups. And as long as I'm on recommendations, let me make another recommendation. Only go to one level of nesting. Take, for example, a global group and nest it inside of a universal group and then stop. Don't take a global group here and then nest it inside of another global group and then take this global group and nest it inside of the universal group and then nest the universal group inside of yet another universal group. That's just going to be a menagerie of security permissions that you're going to have to really go through, and it's going to be difficult if you're having troubleshooting issues and you can't figure out why a user who's a member of this particular global group can't seem to access the resource they think they can. Well, it turns out that this group is denied access, this group's allowed access, deny overrides allow, and it just gets to be on and on and on, a big mess. One advantage, though, if it's something like file permissions, is that if you go to the advanced security properties for the NTFS permissions, then there is an effective permissions tab that will help you to troubleshoot that. Nevertheless, try to keep it real simple and just one level of nesting whenever possible. Now, it's also important to understand something about the default groups that are here, and there's quite a few there, and I'm not going to address each one of them individually, but I'll show you where you can get that information. But what we'll do here is to go to the users container, and we see several of these groups, such as the domain admins. This is going to be a very sensitive security group, and you've got to watch the contents of that group very carefully, because anybody that's a member of domain admins is also automatically added to the local administrators group of all computers throughout the domain, giving them total control over that system. So obviously some of these are more sensitive than others. For example, domain guess, it hardly does anything. So there's really nothing that can really be done with the domain guess except for very rudimentary access. And by default, the only member is this guest account, which is disabled anyway. The domain users is going to be the membership for all users within the domain are by default member of the domain users group, which gives them pretty basic access to network resources. And enterprise admins have pretty complete control over all domains throughout the entire forest. And then domain computers are going to be the members of this domain computer security group, or all the computers throughout the domain. Now, there's several other groups that we won't address quite right now, and then there's also the built-in security groups, which we see here as well. Let's go ahead and take a look at where you can find more information about them. I just recommend you kind of scan through those and just read them over. You don't need to memorize all of them, because some of them are kind of obscure and seldom used. But let's go ahead and take a look at the Help and Support Center to find that information. So let's go ahead and take a look at where you would go, and I'm just going to point this out to you because otherwise it's kind of tedious to just describe each one of all of these groups because there's quite a few of them there. But again, you need to look at these and just kind of get an understanding of what each one of them are. So just go to Active Directory where you saw me click just now, then go to Concepts. Once you're here, go to Understanding Active Directory, then go down here to Understanding Groups. Then go down to Default Groups, and that's where you want to be. Now, once you're into this, you'll see that all the default groups listed in an Active Directory domain, you'll get an understanding of what each one of them does, what kind of capabilities they have, and so forth. In this nugget, we discussed security groups, and in this nugget we talked about how we're going to use those groups. And typically what we decided we were going to do is we're going to take users, put them into groups of some kind, so that we have to administer groups instead of individual users at a time. It's going to be much easier for the administrator, and it doesn't take anything away from the user. And then we took a look at the various group types we have: distribution groups, security groups, domain local, global, universal, all those different kind of things we looked at, as well as how we can use them in their scope. What kind of groups can I place inside of another group, or nest? We took a look at that. We took a look at where you can actually use the groups. Can you use them in their own domain, or can you use them to assign resources in other domains as well? We also took a look at how to convert the group. Sometimes you'll change your mind, or your organization changes the way it uses a certain group. So you might need to convert, for example, a domain local group to a universal group, and then you might need to take a universal group and convert it to a global group. So we take a look at how to do those things, as well as a brief look at the default groups, which I didn't recite to you in a rote fashion, but I showed you where you can access information about those default groups, and you should read through them to take a look at the basic usage of all those groups. I hope this has been informative for you, and I'd like to thank you for viewing.